of the editors at the end. So if I can ask you that, you will see a message on your screens now just to tell you that your meeting will be recorded. If you're uncomfortable with that at any moment, then just please turn your cameras off, and we'll be taking questions at the end of the session, but we'll be fielding those questions in the chat. So if you do have a question for any of the participants here today, if you can throw it in the chat at any point during today's festivities, and we will get to them at the end. So I'm going to pass you over to a familiar face to all of you, I hope, and that's what we hear. So Stephen, if I can hand it over to you just to introduce yourself, the book, and your co-editors as well.
All right, cheers. Well, thank you so much, Chris. And again, we're sort of, since we are remotely at Newman University, I'm going to take over as the person who's I'm actually at Newman today. So welcome to Newman in Birmingham in the United Kingdom. I am going to be introducing just Charles and Peter here, and then they're going to start by talking about a couple of parts of the book. The way that we're going to set this up is Peter is going to talk about the introduction and one of the chapters, and Charles is going to talk about a chapter, and I'll talk about a chapter as well. This isn't everything in the book, of course, but I'll give you an overview of some of the kind of the main ideas that we thought were worth talking about. And again, if you have any questions, if you can put those in the Q&A or in the chat function. As Chris said, I'm Stephen Pihlaja. I'm the reader in stylistics here at Newman, and been here for about 7 years. The leader of this group is Peter Richardson. Peter and I have known each other for, I think, about 10 years. We met in Toledo in Spain in it must have been 2010 or 2011. We had our first discussions about metaphor at the Researching and Applying Metaphor conference that year, and we have sort of been in contact since that time. Peter is in Japan, had been at Hokkaido University for many years, is now at Hokkaido Bunkyo University, or in the process of moving there now. Charles is also in Japan, in Hokkaido at Fuji Women's University. Charles and I have met a grand total of 2 times. This is the second time I've met Charles. We've written a book together, but I have only spoken in person on 2 occasions. Charles is also an expert in cognitive linguistics and Korean language and Buddhism, among other things. So I'm going to turn it over to Peter for now, and I'll come back when it's my turn.
Okay. Do I have it now, Stephen?
Yeah, you should be able to control the access to the presentation. There you go. Yep.
Okay, I got it. Okay. Okay, thank you everyone for coming. Let me jump straight in. I want to give you a quick introduction, and then I want to move on to give you a quick snapshot of the agency chapter and the force dynamics chapter. First of all, the thinking behind the book. One of the things that we're trying to do is bridge the gap between theologians doing cognitive linguistics and cognitive linguists looking at religious texts. Sometimes they kind of operate in separate worlds sometimes, and we're hoping that this volume can bring them together to some degree. I'm struggling with this. It's okay. I'm struggling with this moving the slides forward. We also want to address an imbalance that we see in terms of an overemphasis on focusing on sacred and key religious texts. So we've introduced stuff like looking at YouTube clips, looking at conversations, looking at interactions, looking at video discussions. So we're trying to broaden the focus, and also importantly, we also tried to focus on comparative analysis. So for example, Muslims and Christians talking to each other. We also tried to draw on a wide variety of religious texts. So, okay, of course, Christianity, of course, Islam, of course, Buddhism, but also some forms of Buddhism that aren't usually focused on, like Jodo Shinshu Buddhism in Japan. We've also discussed Confucianism, we've also discussed Shinto and Hinduism. So we try to have a wide variety of religions. We also tried to focus on all the key cognitive linguistic tools. So, of course, the usual suspects, metaphor and metonymy, but also force dynamics, also conceptual blending, and of course, agency. And each tool, we wanted to take a very practical approach. So this isn't, we didn't go deeply into philosophy of language, for example. We've kind of kept the book to this very kind of practical, step-by-step, clear approach to introducing the tools, giving loads of examples, and having a solid case study towards the end. Also introduce and talk through the aspects that make religious language especially challenging. I'll talk about this in a moment, some of the aspects that are unique and especially challenging about religious language. And also to have this thread, this focus on complex systems theory and its application to cognitive linguistics. I know Stephen's going to talk about this in a few moments, so I won't dwell on that. Okay, let me jump to a snapshot of agency. One thing that we were very concerned about was this idea of inverted agency. Now, this comes from Charteris Black. He's used this term, I think it was in his 2017 book. The idea here is when you analyze religious language, religious believers often aren't so much concerned about talking about their religious beliefs as they are concerned about talking about how the object of their belief acts on them. And so in a sense, the agency is flipped. Now, in the agency chapter, we tried to go into more detail about this, what is this inverted agency? So for example, we tried to focus on levels of intensity. So for example, you could have a text where something is that Jesus opened the door for the believer, or Jesus directs the believer. So you get this idea that the divine entity is giving a direction, or the divine entity is removing an obstacle so the believer can move forward. But there's actually no input in the movement itself. Then the next level would be something like leading the believer, where you get an idea of shared movement and the direction being controlled by the divine entity. And then you move on to something like God brings the believer to the truth, or something like that, where then you have the believer being almost completely passive, almost like the believer's being carried. So you can have different levels of intensity in the agency, and this suggests different ways of conceptualizing the divine. And so this is the kind of the meeting point between agency and cognition. We also look at different types of inverted agency. So we've got different levels of intensity, but also different types. So for example, the very conservative evangelical believer, John MacArthur, how is his discourse different from the American evangelical Joel Osteen? One difference we see is that John MacArthur, when he's using inverted agency, is often what we call a metaphysical support type of agency. So for example, he will say, God saves me, God leads me to a deeper truth of himself, or something like that. Whereas when Joel Osteen uses inverted agency, often in some cases, a similar statistical level, a similar level of frequency, but he'll often say things like, I pray to God and God has given me a beautiful wife. I pray to God and God has given me a beautiful house. And so often you'll see a material support agency instead of a metaphysical support agency frame. And what's interesting here is they're conceptualizing the divine in completely different ways, even though they belong to this kind of shared framework of evangelical Christian. To move on to force, I think we all agree that force dynamics underpins all of religious language to some extent. But force dynamics is very explicit in some forms of religious discourse, more so than others. I've just mentioned MacArthur in the previous slide, so it's worth focusing on some of his language here. This is from a sermon. He's talking about Mark 5, I believe, with the Jesus coming to the land and exorcising the demons. So he goes to the Gentile land. What you'll notice, the way John MacArthur interprets this sermon is he interprets it in terms of power and force. And so when the demons come and possess the man, that's the power of the demons overcoming the force tendency of the man and entering the man. And then when Jesus comes along, Jesus's power overpowers the force tendency of the demons, and the demons are exorcised. And what's even more interesting in the way that John MacArthur interprets that passage is that John MacArthur also connects it to danger. And so for John MacArthur, the people that knew the demon-possessed man, they were scared of the demon-possessed man because he was violent. And so they saw him as a danger. But then Jesus comes along, he exorcises the demon, and according to John MacArthur's interpretation, then the people say to Jesus, you have to leave, you have to go. Why? Because they view Jesus as even a bigger danger than the demons. From John MacArthur's perspective, he sees this as a battle of sin. They sense Jesus's righteousness, therefore they see Jesus as an even bigger danger. Now, what's interesting in that sermon is you see this intermingling of power, force, and danger. So you get this very rich conceptualization of how John MacArthur views the relationship between the divine, the human, and the demons and the devil. Also, jumping now to Hinduism, we can see examples where force dynamic relationships are flipped. Also, this idea of metaphors also flipped. We've called this source domain reversal. This is a very interesting example here. So this is from a YouTube clip. Sadhguru, the title of the YouTube clip is "What is Enlightenment?" So Sadhguru, this Hindu teacher, he's talking about the definition of enlightenment. Now, of course, enlightenment, very conventional metaphor. The idea is the light shines in the practitioner's mind, and it shows that there is only one self, the Atman. There's no subject-object relationship. And so that's the conventional understanding of enlightenment. Sadhguru turns around and says, well, okay, but he says we can flip it. We can also view it as endarkment. And the idea of endarkment is if you have a beam of light that doesn't hit anything, it's never seen, it's nothing. And that's nirvana. And so you can see he's completely flipped it. Now, from Sadhguru's perspective, if it hits an object, that's something like marriage, or thinking about marriage, or thinking about a relationship, or thinking about love for your parents, or thinking about a job. That's an obstacle where light hits, and then suddenly you have attachment. You don't have nirvana. But when you become completely unattached, the beam of light passes through everything, and it's never seen. And so then you have nirvana. Now, what's interesting is if you think about it in force dynamic terms, Talmi would often view force dynamics in terms of one force tendency overcoming another force tendency. But in this situation, what it is one of the force tendencies disintegrates. It's not overcome, it disintegrates, it fades. And the other force just passes through it because it's no longer a force tendency. And for Sadhguru, that's nirvana, that's enlightenment. So you see this kind of clever play on force dynamic understandings in the text. Give me a second, just go to the last slide, right. And just to finish, just in the last couple of minutes, there's this beautiful Thomas Merton text that I want to finish with. Now, space is a crucial concept in cognitive linguistics. And this idea of there, here, within, and become in terms of conceptualizing the divine is I think is like core and fundamental to what it is to be religious. And so the idea that God is over there, the idea that God is here, the idea that the divine entity is within you, and the mystical, the kind of more mystical or the more Buddhist conception, the more non-dualist perception, where you are the divine, or you become the divine. Now, what's interesting is what can happen in religious texts is that you can slide between these different conceptions. Now, this connects with what Stephen's going to talk about when we come to complex systems. So over the same discourse, you can see a slide between the divine entity being there, here, within, and becoming. A beautiful example is this text from Thomas Merton's autobiography. And you see here that Christ is on the cross. So he's being perceived as something that's over there. He's doing something for humanity. And then you see also in this text, Christ is within Thomas Merton. And you also see this idea that Thomas Merton is being melted into Christ. And so you've got all of these kind of slides in force dynamic relationships going on. Now, what's interesting is when God is external, you can see God as a false tendency acting on the sinner. And so you can see that God is the greater false tendency. But when Thomas Merton melts into God, you're getting the antagonist and the agonist blending together and becoming one antagonist, and then they're acting on the world. The world as the agonist. So when you spread Roman Catholicism, when you do good in the world, you get this idea of this blended antagonist now acting on the agonist that is the world. So you get these very interesting plays on force dynamic patterns across the discourse as you follow the discourse. So that's me. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you for turning up. I'll pass it on to Charles, I believe.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit today about the conceptual blending chapter, and just kind of reiterate a few points, concerning the chapter. Throughout the book, we try to talk about, how to apply cognitive linguistics to everyday discourse, and we also want to kind of bring in, discourse-oriented approaches and kind of show how those are, those can be, analyzed using cognitive linguistic kind of tools. And then we also wanted to, like Peter mentioned, talk about things that were kind of specific to religious language. And so in this chapter, that's kind of what I want to go over, an example of that. And so, with the conceptual blending chapter, we have a lot of examples we go through of various blends and various types of blends. But I'd like to go ahead and just kind of start out, with the blend that occurs at the end of the chapter. And so first of all, for a few of you might not be familiar with conceptual blending. So just real briefly, let's see. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so we're just real briefly, the theory of conceptual blending, was developed by Foucault and Turner. And blends occur when distinct conceptual packets are brought together from two or more inputs to form a more complex idea. So the joining of the input spaces is sanctioned by shared general features, which are listed in the generic space, so at the top of the diagram. And the elements in the input spaces, two or more input spaces, are related through relationships, such as analogy, disanalogy, and so on. And so these elements from the inputs are then selectively projected. So sometimes in combined form to the blended space. And so we talk about, at the end of the chapter, we talk about application of this to what we call the 4 instruments blend. So this, the reason I thought this was interesting was, normally we think of blends and we're analyzing language. And in this case, we're looking at a ritual. And so this is a ritual that's carried out, twice daily in large, Buddhist monasteries in South Korea in the morning and in the evening. Okay, so in this blend, to start out here, we have the generic space, we have 3 input spaces, we have a blended space on the bottom. And kind of the core idea of the blend that's giving it a lot of its structure is in this Dharma space. So in Mahayana Buddhism, we have this idea of the Bodhisattva who's working to save all sentient beings in all these different realms. And the Bodhisattva has these properties of compassion, and he's giving teachings. Okay, and so if we look up at the generic space, like what is this in just kind of general terms, it's this idea you have a powerful force and it's manifesting this power, and there's a certain range of the effect. Okay, and then in the ritual space, so in how this actually appears in the ritual, we have 4 instruments. And with the instruments, they all have a tonal, they all have different characteristics. So for example, there's a tonal height. For example, the small chime you hit has a very high tone, and then the big drum is very low tone, and so on. And then we have things like the number of strikes, and then we have the characteristics of the sounds, how the objects are made. And then we even have things like gesture, and so, or movement. And so when the monk is hitting the drum, he's hitting it very fast, and so on. Let's see. Actually, I didn't hit that. Was that? Let's see. I don't know why that advanced. I didn't hit anything. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, so actually let's go ahead and advance, and then I'll come back to this slide actually. So to go forward again. So just looking at those 2 spaces, let's see. Pausing a bit.
If it's not working, Charles, I can do it for you.
Okay, yeah, do you want to just go to the next slide? There you go. Okay, so just looking at those 2 spaces, we have all of these, very rich correspondences. And so, for example, with the 4 instruments, they all represent beings in a certain realm. So you have the cloud gong, that instrument on the right that's flat and circular, that represents flying animals because it has a very high tone. Then we have the wooden fish, that has kind of a middle level tone, so that represents animals in the water. We have the large drum, and so that represents 4-legged land animals. And then we have the giant bell, which has a very low tone, and so that represents all the beings in hell. And then we have the number of strikes. So in the morning, the bell is hit 28 times, and so that represents the 28 constellations. And so in the kind of classical sense of the universe, that would just be everything. And so the Bodhisattva's compassion, the idea is it's just going everywhere. And then in the evening, it's hit 33 times, and that's the heaven of the 33. And that's this giant mountain that people used to think was kind of in the middle of the universe. And then we have the sound properties of the instruments. And so a lot of the instruments is very jarring. And so we have this idea that it's going to, cause people to awaken. It's very loud, and so it, causes people to pay attention. And then, like with the bell, there's that kind of reverberating sound. It keeps kind of coming back and back and so on, and it rings for a long time. So this idea that the Bodhisattva's compassion, is very enduring. Okay, and then we have, other object properties. And so, this is or other properties of the ritual. So the rituals, first in the morning, so it's very important. And the instruments are very large, much larger than their secular counterparts. And then the pavilion where the 4 instruments are is right in the center of the monastery, showing that it's important. And then you have the gestural properties. The monk hitting the drum is hitting it very vigorously. And so we have all of these properties that map over. So let's go and let's look back at the previous slide. So let's see. Yeah, so we have these mappings between those 2 spaces. And then there's an extra space here because we have that wooden fish, and that wooden fish actually represents a whole story. And so we have this story of this great Zen master who, one of his disciples who was very lazy and was kind of a bad monk. And so that disciple becomes a fish. And he has the disciple, because he has bad karma, has a tree growing out of his back. And so the great master sees this fish struggling in the water, and he does this ritual, and he saves the fish, and he ends up, being reborn as a monk again, so he can get enlightened and so on. And so we have this fish, and that fish is kind of a condensation of that entire story. And if you look at the structure of that story, it's the same, it has that same structure as in the generic space and in the other input spaces. And so within the blended space, we get this idea that the whole ritual, represents how the Bodhisattva, who is so great and has such compassion, his compassion reaches everywhere, and he's trying to save all beings throughout the cosmos. And so I thought this was a really good example of how blending does not just work with language, but also works with things like ritual. And one thing that's different with ritual, when we think of ritual and language, the average person looking at this, going to a temple, they wouldn't see all of these things right away. But if they're a Buddhist and they go to the temple constantly and they hear explanations and so on, eventually all of these connections would take shape. And so you have this thing in ritual that's very different than language. If I'm speaking and if I use a blend, I have to create it very quickly, and the other person has to understand the entire blend very quickly, or it's not going to function at all. But with ritual, we can kind of pack in a lot of stuff, and then that can just be slowly unpacked, by different people over time. So it might take years and years to finally get at all of the implications. And so we have that kind of sense in ritual. There's a Latin term I really like that I saw, that sensus plenior, this idea that certain teachings or certain things would have much deeper meaning than even the people who are saying something or are doing a ritual would even realize themselves. And so there's deep meaning there that can just constantly be kind of fathomed by the believer who's going to the temple. Okay, so let's see, am I about out of time there? How am I doing on time, Stephen?
I think you're about done. Did you have, is that I think that's your final slide here.
Yeah, so it's so the final point here is, this is kind of a nice example of how we can have multimodal blends that are primarily non-linguistic. They're based on other modalities such as sound, imagery, and gesture. And the example also shows how blends in ritual function differently than blends in spoken discourse. So the greater complexity reflects the fact that they're repeated and can be unpacked gradually over time as ritual participants become more aware of the significance of the various features of ritual. All right, so want to go ahead, Stephen, and
okay,
from
great.
there?
thank both of you. I'll try to go on to our next bit, which is about complex systems theory. So this is the one of the final chapters in the book where I'm taking sort of a larger perspective in terms of the kinds of the things that we've been focusing on so far have been really focused on individual theories or ideas about blending, about metaphor. There's an awful lot about metaphor. Anyone who's worked in religious language is aware of that. But in this final chapter, I talk about complex systems theory and a little bit about the discourse dynamics approach, which is Lynn Cameron's project of using complex systems theory to do analysis of discourse. The idea of complex systems is a bit difficult to get your head around. I put the idea or the picture of the traffic jam here as an example of this, which is if you think about a traffic jam, why does a traffic jam occur? Why does any individual traffic jam occur? Well, you could probably think about common causes of traffic jams. You could think about common times of day when there are different traffic jams. But actually, when you're trying to describe any individual traffic jam, you have to take apart a bunch of different elements and think about the connections between them that have led to the traffic jam emerging. It's not always just one simple thing. And sometimes what could create a traffic jam in particular places, I mean, the M25 is a good example of this in London, which is the road around the main road around London, and it's continually getting expanded, but still has traffic jams on it. And one of the things that complex systems talks about is that as the system changes, as things change, that other elements within the system change as well. So if you add more lanes to a highway, you get more drivers. That's one of the things that happens. So this idea that everything that's happening is connected to other things that are within an individual system, and that if you're trying to understand interaction, which is sort of the thing that I'm mainly interested in, you have to be able to unpack connections between not just two individuals talking to each other, not just the words that they're using, but having an idea of their individual context, the social context, the physical context. In the case of religious discourse, so sort of the history of the kind of discourse that they're engaged in. So if they're talking about a particular topic, you have to be aware of how people have talked about that in the past. And so as you're looking at interaction between two peoples, it's this kind of balance of these two things. First of all, that there's connections between all these different components within an individual system that can lead to different outcomes. But that also there's patterns that you can notice within complex systems. So the idea of traffic jams, as they say, we couldn't tell you why any individual traffic jam happened, but we could say that accidents are common causes of traffic jams, right? If there's an accident that could cause a traffic jam, or a particular time of day could cause a traffic jam. So you have these different patterns that you see, and so it's in some way trying to understand the regular patterns that you see within interaction, within discourse, and then also trying to understand when things don't go in the way that you expect necessarily, what is sort of influencing that, what is making the outcomes be the way that they are. And so this kind of analysis that takes into takes into mind the idea of complex systems theory is trying to in some way tease apart those different connections and say, okay, we have the interaction that occurs in this way. It becomes a particular kind of interaction. Why is that? What can we do to unpack the different elements, the different components to figure out why an interaction has gone the way that it is? And in Lynn's book, she talks about these. Well, I guess there's 5 different levels, but it starts with a kind of a point zero of interaction, which is that whenever you have two people or any discourse event, anytime where there's interaction happening, that there is this whole history of interaction behind that individual instance. So people have their own histories, they have their own awareness of theology. As we're talking about religious language, of course, it can apply to any kind of interaction, but all that stuff is feeding into the interaction that we have. And then the next bit to think about is level 1, which is we think about interaction from a discourse analytic perspective. I think that my perspective tends to be not as closely focused on kind of the moment by moment interaction, but actually the moment by moment interaction is quite important. Sort of the millisecond interaction that people have, the reactions can happen quite quickly and have important impacts on how interaction develops. The example I always give is you know the moment when you've said something wrong to your partner, right? It doesn't take more than a half a second to notice that moment, like, I said the wrong thing, right? That is that highlights the importance of sort of the moment by moment interaction, that if someone's face changes, some small element, someone smiles, that has an impact on how interaction develops going forward. Then the level 2 of interaction is sort of the minute by minute engagement, the kinds of things that we think of generally as discourse analysts, where we're looking at conversation analysts are looking at turns in conversations, when one person says something, how another person responds to it, and those two things connecting with one another. And then you can think about a whole conversation, or this whole presentation could be an example of a single discourse event. So you can look at these different scales of interaction and focus on analysis in different ways. And then level 4 takes all of that together, all the things that have transpired in an individual discourse event, and it feeds into the point 0 of what happens next, right? So every individual conversation, every individual presentation that you go to is part of how you go on to see interaction, or you see, in the case of presentations in the future, that can have experience or have influence on generic things like conversations, but it could also have influences on sort of the emergence of things like, particular vocabulary items or idioms, all those sorts of things. So you can think about different scales of that as well. So in terms of the kind of the analysis that I do in the chapter that I'm looking at, we've been looking at sermons and elaborate interactions between rituals, and I'm looking at Dawa preachers on YouTube. Dawa is a kind of Islamic outreach. The person that I'm doing analysis of in this book is a guy called Ali Dawa, and he makes videos for his primarily Muslim audience. In this case, I have the picture there. That's not Ali Dawa. That's Musa, one of his friends, and he's doing this one part of the series that he has called Ask the Sheikh, and there is Sheikh Haytham. I tried to get a good screenshot of the actual moment of interaction that we're talking about here, where Musa is asking the Sheikh a question, and the Sheikh is looking at him slightly skeptically, as you can see if you look at the transcript of what he's asking him about. So Musa in this video is asking the Sheikh about sort of teaching about marrying people ostensibly outside of your tribe. That word tribe being in inverted commas there. That what should someone do, or what should a young Muslim person do if their parents are unhappy with the person that they've chosen for marriage? And if you look at how Musa is explaining this, he says it, I think, as describing what's going on. And you can look at in sort of line 38 and 39 there, 40, where they're talking about just sort of petty reasons. So very kind of classic child description of their parents' view on something. So what does discourse dynamics offer us for this? Well, we could think about, first of all, that point 0, the point 0 that we're coming from is Musa's understanding of asking questions about marriage, sort of the experiences that he's had in the past, all of the understanding that he has about this question that is leading him to the moment to ask about this particular issue. In that moment by moment interaction, I think it's interesting if you look at a lot of the ums and ahs that come up here, particularly when he gets to the end, we see him, and if you watch the video, you can tell that he's not especially confident in this question. I think he perhaps has some sense of what the Sheikh's going to say to him, but you could look at that moment. There's a hesitancy and understand something about his expectation about what's going to occur. And then you could probably also talk about the trajectory of the question as well, how he gets from the logic that he's using to the question that he asks in the end. Well, if you think about the whole discourse event, of course, we don't just need the question, but we need the answer as well. And so here is the Sheikh answering the question. And of course, the Sheikh's answer is more confident. If you look at, again, watching the video, he responds in a more with less hesitance than Musa does. But the Sheikh, his response to it is essentially that you've got to think about the parents, and the parents probably aren't just saying no for no good reason at all. They probably do have these good reasons, which he's quickly able to list about what might be the problem with the marriage and why someone might be opposing it. Now, again, we just talked about where Musa's coming from. You could do the same thing in looking at Sheikh Haytham's response to it, his moment by moment response. You could think about his point zero as well, where he's coming from, the trajectory of his answer. And in the end, you could take this whole question and answer series together and say, this fits into in terms of how it's fitting into what happens after it, how it fits into the system as the system goes forward, as examples of, well, it could be examples of the ways that sheikhs answer questions to young Muslims. That could be one thing. It could be about YouTube videos about asking the sheikh particular questions, how those develop. You could take that any individual video and see how it's helping to build a kind of genre, that it exists in this kind of line of videos that come before it and then videos that come after it. And depending on how you're interested in doing the analysis, you could look at that development over time as well. This is just a quick example of that, but of course the chapter talks about it in much more depth. We've come to the end of the presentation that we have. There's some references here to the text that we talked about, also some of the academic sources as well. I put up here the slides to the video and the book as well as our contacts. Peter, I put your personal email because I know you're switching organizations, so I'll get if you want to email Peter, that's probably the best way to catch him for now. We'd said we were going to take some questions as well. So if you have want to put the questions in the chat, that is probably the best way to do that. I don't think anybody has put anything in just yet. And I think Chris is going to moderate those if he's
sure,
there.
I'm happy to do that. Thank you, Stephen, Peter, and Charles for introducing us to this introductory reader, I suppose, from Routledge. Some of our colleagues might be able to see in the chat that I put the link to the whole book if people are inclined to go and buy it. That will help the bottom line, I'm sure. Yes,
I will say that they have produced a paperback version of it. So unlike most academic versions, academic books, this one is actually you probably could afford.
Yeah, so this accessibility is really important for the university's ethos and the ways we want to think about research at Newman University. So, so I see Helena in the chat has thanked you for the presentation on behalf of Routledge as well. So that's high praise indeed. It's great for you to join us, Helena. Thank you. If any other colleagues have got any questions for the chat, then please throw them in there now. So we have Sue from Theology at Newman. Thank you, Sue. Writing, if you'd like, gentlemen, to talk about the material you focused on as your examples. Were you looking at representative examples, representative work? Could you have gone into more detail with more examples? And I can hop onto that as well. Sue, I love this idea
Yeah.
of the ensemble of complexity that all of you were really talking about. Can you give us a few more examples of that, just along the lines that Sue describes in the chat there?
Yeah, as far as the material, we tried to take material from a lot of different traditions, and so I would say, a lot of it's from, of course, the major religions, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, and then we have some stuff from Confucianism and other things as well. In that example I showed, I was actually a Buddhist monk at a monastery for 2 years. And that was, the ritual that they did twice a day. And so I'm very familiar with it. And I'm very familiar with Korean Buddhism. And so, part of that was because I wanted to work with something that, I had a lot of familiarity with.
Yeah, I think also the weighting, we're aware that most work that's come before us has often focused on the key text and the sacred text. So we deliberately wanted to look at stuff that in a way is less representative, but perhaps in other ways more popular. And so that's why we've looked at things like YouTube clips, which I think are far more contemporary, but they're not classical in that sense of the word. And also, we often tried to find examples that were comparative. So, for example, Stephen was looking at Muslim and Christian conversation. I think we've also looked at that in other chapters with video discussions of Christians and Muslims. So I think perhaps there is a move. Our book is more focused on popular religious discourse. I think also, Charles, your example, Charles, is perhaps kind of more of like the day-to-day reality of Buddhism, right? Rather than like some theoretical kind of textual exposition. So yes, I think it's weighted more towards the popular than it is academic sources.
I would say too, I mean, popular is one way of describing it. I think in terms of sort of the day-to-day discourse of people who actually believe, this is how believers talk about their belief, and that is important to us to not just talk about, how theologians represent belief, but how real people talk about what they believe. And I think there's been a movement in that in terms of just analyzing religious discourse and language more generally. Valerie Hobbs has a new book that's come out this year that's about that as well, about looking at religious language and sort of in real context, how people are actually using it. And that's, I think, in our way of doing analysis, particularly interaction being quite important. That this is a kind of the kind of language that needs to have attention paid to it.
So your answer was prescient because it's answered a question by Sheena Gardner in the chat as well. So thank you all. I mean, I was about to comment on that idea of talking about doing religion, rather than thinking about the kind of theoretical aspects, which I really like. And as a historian, I can see historians applying these kind of concepts to documents, source material, things in the past. I wish I could get to grips with what my subjects were doing in the 17th century and how they were thinking about doing it. But with that in mind, this is a reader, an introduction to cognitive linguistics and religious language. I mean, obviously you have audience groups in mind. I'm very aware that people from Routledge are here, so they're thinking, they're going to be listening to what you say here. But it seems to me that all three of the examples that you gave, the methodology could be applied easily by theologians. You've already touched on that, but could also be used by anthropologists and historians at the very least. I'm thinking about ways that I could try to apply this, probably in quite a weak way, to documentary sources from the 16th, 17th, 18th century. I mean, did you have that in mind? I mean, is this, in terms of how it's pitched, or is there a certain way that somebody like me would need to approach this book to be able to take that? I mean, because to Stephen's point, Stephen, you're talking, this is Bruno Latour, right? This is about systems and complexity. And other scholars have been desperate to apply this to their fields. And it looks like this is a way to go and play with that idea and to give kind of a foothold for the rest of us who actually want to start thinking about these issues in other disciplines. Can you just comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I can start. I think, yeah, the idea of writing an introduction, I think, is an important thing, particularly for cognitive linguistics. I'd never describe myself as a cognitive linguist before. I probably won't ever do it again either. Under the right circumstances, Peter has sort of converted me to it. But the idea of making something, if I could understand it, then I could write about it. I think that idea of making it simple enough for me to understand means that probably, definitely, Chris, you could understand it as well, and most other people who are engaged in thinking about these sorts of issues. So yeah, that was definitely on our minds as we were working on it.
Yeah, and I think this is we're applying cognitive linguistic tools to religious language, but we're very well aware that it's cognitive linguistic tools have been applied to other types of language. I mean, I'm thinking of Christopher Hart. He's applied force dynamics, metaphor, metonymy, conceptual blending to media texts. So you definitely, these cognitive linguistic tools are neutral. We've kind of weaponized them for analyzing religious language, but we're well aware that they could be operationalized to apply to any kinds of texts. Definitely.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that was a much more thoughtful set of responses to my question than it probably deserved. So we have a few questions have come in on the chat here. So one from John, talking about kind of the analytical method that Stephen, you particularly were talking about when you're looking at a discourse in the way that you showed, are those minute-by-minute interactions cumulative? Does that affect the discourse, and how do you analyze that? And Stephen, you can see the rest of John's question.
Yeah, thank you for the question, John. I think that's a really good. How do you decide if something's important or not? I mean, that's a big issue for discourse analysts just in general. And I think that as you're looking at a particular event, as we're comparing those two speakers to each other. That's one issue that I thought was important to bring up, and to also look at the trajectory of the event as well. So if there are times when an individual is speaking very confidently, and there are times when an individual is not speaking very confidently, then you should pay attention to that, to say that there's something going on at that moment that suggests something, whether or not that suggests hesitancy or whatever I've interpreted it as. That's my interpretation as an analyst. But I think the larger point is that as a discourse analyst, when we see sort of discrepancies or we see patterns and then things that go against that pattern, those are the things that I think are worth paying attention to.
Thank you, Stephen, for that. So we have a question in the chat about how to analyze and interpret religious metaphors. Do we need to look at the idea of interpreting metaphor based on religious scholars' point of view? Some religious scholars have different ideas about religious metaphors. So again, another methodological question here.
It's a really good question. It's a good question. In the book, we actually addressed that at one point because, this word metaphor, a lot of people have this idea, it's kind of like myth. If you say the word metaphor, then you're talking about something that's not real. And of course, it doesn't really mean that. I mean, something can be real, it can still be a metaphor. But there is this issue of, exactly, quite often when you're analyzing religious texts, when you're looking at meaning, it's like, well, whose meaning? Is it the person who originally wrote something, or is it the way people are understanding it? And you get all of these kind of complex levels of analysis, that you have to take into account that you really don't have with everyday language. With this idea of like, is something a metaphor? We actually have a part in the book where we talk about this idea of hellfire. And so, some people would say, well, it's just literally fire. People go somewhere and there's going to be fire and it's just fire, but then if you really look at it, it's not just fire, because there are elements of that that are clearly not like fire. The fire never goes out and it just stays there, and there's something different about it. And so how do you analyze this? If you analyze it based on metaphor, like cognitive linguistics analysis, you have a problem, because with metaphor, all of the everything should be going from the source to the target. The target would be punishment, and the source would be fire, but you really don't seem to have that. And so we have a section in the blending chapter where we take a look at that in terms of blending. And so if it's a blend, you actually have elements that are coming from both fire and from divine punishment, and they're creating kind of a unique blend and a unique concept. So yeah, but that's a great question. It's definitely a real issue. And
yeah, and to add
religious language.
To add to what Charles is saying, also we try to avoid interpreting metaphors directly from a sacred text. So talking about scholars of religion. So for example, when I look at Mark 5, I don't want to, we try to avoid getting into how do we interpret Mark 5 as a sacred text. What we're interested in is how does John MacArthur interpret Mark 5. So it's not, we actually try to avoid going, to these very old sacred texts that are often written in other languages, and we try to keep to the people that are interpreting them, rather than kind of doing biblical studies. We're very aware that we're doing cognitive linguistics rather than biblical studies.
Yeah, that's a lovely set of answers, and I think it leads us nicely to perhaps our last question for this launch, and that's from Daniel. So Daniel's talking about if the three of you had come across moments where religious language and the analytical terms that you were using were deployed or managed self-consciously by those people using them. And I suppose this is to Charles's point, Peter's point of being quite deliberate about this is somebody's interpretation of that particular story, that particular metaphor. So do you sometimes find, and I'm really extrapolating from Daniel's question here, and Daniel, you can stop me if you really like, but is that conflict helpful? Sometimes can you extrapolate something or some extra meaning from those moments of dissonance between your analytical terms and the ways in which those people you're observing use them? And Daniel, just shake your head or nod your head if that's what if I'm butchering that question. I think that's it. So
yeah,
if anyone, both of you.
Yeah, can I just pick up on the idea of the self-conscious use of language, and the self-conscious kind of manipulation of language? I think this gets at intentionality. What are people's intentions when they use religious language? And definitely there seems to be times where religious people are using language very self-consciously, and they're using metaphor very self-consciously. They're using it very deliberately. But then there are other times when there are things going on in the text where the writer, the author, may not be aware of the conceptualizations that they're portraying. Now, the problem for us is it's very, very difficult as linguists to actually get it. When is it deliberate and when is it not deliberate? And that's often a nest of vipers. It's often a minefield. It's a very rich area. There's definitely a lot going on there, but it's just whether as analysts we can get at that safely and accurately.
There's quite a literature around deliberate metaphor. I don't think there's anybody who's left in the chat who has publicly taken a very strong opinion about that one way or the other. But that is something that has certainly been discussed in the literature.
Well, thank you very much to all three of you, and I think I should ask everybody who is still with us. We've overrun ever so slightly, just to show your appreciation in whatever way you can, whether that's through an emoji, applause, real applause or any other secret signals you'd like to send the editors on this one. So yes, thank you very much to Stephen, Charles and Peter, and to all of you as well for coming today. I think that last question on intentionality was a bit of a viper's nest, but it opened up this idea of just how much this book could actually connect to the work that a lot of people are doing. I think even if it's difficult to read intentions, I think I can say that I'm very grateful for what you three gentlemen have presented to us today. So thank you very much, and thank you to all of you. So I suppose all that remains for me to say is thank you for joining us today at this virtual Newman Humanities Research Centre event to celebrate the launch of this fascinating book published by Routledge. So once again, I will plug it for the editors. It is in the chat there. There is a paperback version, Steve tells me, and please go and get it for your library and enjoy the contents and try and apply it to your own work and your own lives if you can. So yeah, I think perhaps, gentlemen, if you would like to maybe say a few words to close, and then we'll let our delegates leave.
Just thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you in person soon enough. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.